video, I talked about the fundamentals of Islam and the 5 pillars of Islam and how it was founded. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the different movements within the Muslim faith and also some of the contemporary implications of it in relation to the Western context. So in the 18th and 19th century, there was a series of Islamic reformist movements in response to European colonization and imperialism and expansion and industrialization. And so it's important to remember that Europe had dominated or had colonized about 85% of the world in 1914. So clearly there's going to be a reaction to it. So in the 18th century, you have the founding of Wahhabism, which was in response to a decline in the Muslim community and prayer, and it was basically an idea of returning to the fundamentals of Islam. It is more of a conservative Islamic movement, and when it was first founded, it did not have connections to terrorism, but in terms of how it's changed over the past couple of centuries, it has been connected to more conservative versions of Islam and various terrorist sects of Islam. But many individuals who are Muslim don't necessarily agree with Wahhabism. And so Wahhabism is basically a lot more conservative in terms of emphasizing conformity, trying to bring people back to the fundamentals of Islam by focusing exclusively on the Quran. And there are a lot of implications for people's behavior. Saudi Arabia is one of the more well-known countries that practices more of this kind of fundamental conservative form of Islam. So that's why you see more of a strict kind of way of existing. There's a lot more kind of self-discipline that's required, and you see women not just wearing the hijab, which is a partial head covering, but the niqab, which is like the full body covering with just the gap for the eyes. And then throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, you see just a resistance to European colonization and imperialism, because at that time, European scholars and thinkers and leaders were critiquing Islam, specifically Muslim culture, and saying that it was backwards. And so then individuals who were Muslim were reacting to it and saying, hey, we're not backwards, right? They just didn't want to become Christian. And so that was basically the tension there. So in order to resist this colonization of ideas and culture and religion, they wanted to interpret Islam in light of social change and figure out how can we still practice this within the Western context or within this Western expansion, because there was this idea that individuals who practice Islam are backwards, and so how can one still maintain their faith while still dealing with the reality of European colonization? And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, you see the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood, where they were kind of resisting these paths to Western development, and they wanted to try to figure out how to maintain Muslim identity while still kind of living in the Western context or a globalized Western context. And so unfortunately, right, there's that kind of connotation to more extreme versions or radical Islam and terrorist organizations and things like that. But when it was first founded, that obviously wasn't the idea behind it. And then you also see this divide emerge between the Sunni Muslims and the Shia Muslims. And this divide has to do with leadership and succession after Muhammad died. So the Sunni Muslims, they're about 80% of Muslims. And so they believe that Muhammad didn't necessarily choose a leader or choose a successor, so they don't have to be related to him. Whereas the Shia Muslims, they are about 20% of the Muslim population, and they believe that Muhammad specifically chose Ali, who was his cousin and son-in-law, to be his successor. So basically, individuals who can be leaders of Islam have to be related to Muhammad. So that's kind of the main divide there between the Sunni and the Shia Muslims. Obviously, there's more, but that's kind of the main idea here. So in terms of Islam in today, clearly we have to talk about kind of the elephant in the room with ISIS. Now, most Muslims don't agree with ISIS. They condemn ISIS. ISIS claims that they are an Islamic organization in terms of, establishing the caliphate, establishing this Islamic kind of place for people to exist. And so, unfortunately, though, it's been associated with Islam, but many Muslims say ISIS is not Muslim. They are violating the principles of nonviolence that are an important part of Quran and Islamic teaching. So another kind of connotation with Islam that's been established in the West is the idea of jihad, which means struggle. This struggle that we have now. Its original connotation, though, is not about kind of this political struggle, but it's more about an internal struggle that we as human beings have with sin. So we want to be pure, we want to not be corrupt, but at the same time, we want to do bad things, we want to be sinful. So it's more about our personal and social struggle. It doesn't really have to do with violence. It's more about exerting oneself for God in this kind of personal way. And then many people are familiar with the term Sharia, but what does it mean? It basically means the road or the way to establishing kind of Islamic law, but it's basically saying that, God established rules for people to follow. That's found in many religions, and human beings can't necessarily legislate or make new laws because they don't really understand the essence of God, so they don't have the ability to make these new laws. And that the Quran then is a primary source of the law. So we have to follow the Quran if we're following Sharia law. It doesn't have to do with some of the extreme kind of terrorist organizations that the West thinks of. And then I also wanted to mention Sufism, which has to do with one's inner way or personal relationship to God. It is more of a mystical, spiritual tradition, and their love for God inspires beautiful Sufi poetry, and they're also searching for this hidden meaning in the Quran, but they're not kind of part of mainstream Islam. They're kind of a sect of it, more of a spiritual, mystical sect of it. Another important kind of modern day implication here to think about is women in Islam. So I think the Western perspective is that, women in Islam are oppressed, they have to cover themselves constantly, they have to dress modestly. And so according to kind of the Quran and just like the Muslim faith, women are regarded as being equal to men in God's eyes, and women also have a right to education, and it's not necessarily the religious teachings that say that women have to be oppressed. It's more about kind of the political, cultural implications that have been established over time with Wahhabism, for example. So it's not as if Islam intrinsically says like, oh yes, women need to, women shouldn't be able to drive, women have to cover themselves constantly. It's more about the interpretation of that. And so Islamic belief is about modesty, but it's about everyone being modest in multiple areas of their life because they don't want to make people who don't have what they have feel bad. And so for women, for example, both men and women need to dress modestly, and it's the way it's been kind of interpreted for women that we see this, we do see this difference. However, a way to think about this modesty is that, someone can say that it encourages people to not solely look at women as physical objects all the time. So it could lead to perhaps more equality in the workplace if people are focusing more on what the woman is doing rather than what she looks like and how attractive she is. So modesty could be a way for a woman perhaps to be viewed more as a human being rather than just as a sex object. So I think that's kind of an interesting take on the ideas of what women should and shouldn't wear in Islam, and specifically in Muslim majority countries. And also some Muslim countries, right, require a burqa, some don't, and or a hijab or a niqab. And so there's different variations, whereas the hijab is, a partial head covering. You can still see someone's face, you can still see them, but the niqab and the hijab are more of the full covering with different iterations. So it's not as if every Muslim majority country is requiring women to do that. It's more of the more conservative Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia, for example. So I think that's also something to think about, just kind of the differences in what women should wear and the practices throughout these different countries and cultures.